Good evening, and welcome to The Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy. Today is November 13th, 2018. The midterms have come and gone, and yet they have not come and gone. The struggle for power in the United States continues, and at the moment we have what looks to be a democratic effort to change the outcome of the election in their favor using fair means or foul. Now, many people in the media, the legacy media particularly, will claim that voter fraud or election officials doing fraud-like or committing fraud is not something that happens in American politics. And this is absolutely naive if it is naive if they are not outright lying. They know, most people know, that there have been many, many historical instances of stealing votes, creating votes, destroying ballots, and all kinds of things. Almost everything that you can imagine. The old stuffing the ballot box, the broken voting machines, unbelievable, all kinds of things have gone on in American politics. So we're seeing a continuation of what's happening. I think back to 2000, the year 2000, when Al Gore was in the running with George W. Bush. And George W. Bush ended up getting the presidency. Yet, in Florida, like we're seeing now in the midterm election, the Florida situation was a hotbed of fraud and voter suppression and suddenly found ballots and all kinds of shenanigans going on. And it was the Republicans who basically turned the election in their favor and got in George W. Bush. Now, what difference that would have made in American history, it's absolutely impossible to tell. And I don't think I've never read anything speculating what an Al Gore presidency would have been like and how American history and world history really might have been changed. Would it have been for the better? We have no way of knowing. I do feel that 9/11, Dick Cheney who was the vice president for George W. Bush, was heavily involved, and basically ran the show in the basement of the White House during that horrific event of 9/11. And I consider him to be a war criminal, unindicted, still running around free. George W. Bush probably knew about it, but didn't really care. It was something that just had to be done. And they shunted him out. He was down and reading a book about donkeys or something to school children, and they put him in the most innocuous sounding and innocent looking position that they could find. And there's so much evidence pointing to the rogue element, a very high level rogue element, the American government, orchestrating 9/11. And the idea that Osama bin Laden might have orchestrated 9/11 from a cave in Afghanistan is just patently absurd. And it's the very worst kind of fairy tale. And to call it a conspiracy theory is actually giving it more credence than it deserves. The 9/11 required the active participation of very high-level people in the U.S. government in order for it to have come off. There needed to be collusion in many, many areas. So this is a matter for history. And there are many, many people who have written many books about 9/11, exposing Building 7 and so on, and putting all the information out there. And yet, as long as the legacy media, who are controlled by essentially fascist, globalist, corporatist power mongers, the power elite, the true information about 9/11 will not come out. And the only way it will come out officially is if one of the organs of the establishment, and I'm thinking New York Times, Washington Post, and a few other legacy media outlets, the only way that the truth about 9/11 will be accepted by the sheeple, those who only believe the legacy media, is if there's a front page story headlined 9/11 co-conspirator Dick Cheney, George W. Bush indicted for treason and mass murder for 9/11. And that is not something we're going to see. We're simply not going to see it. These are true criminals. Back in the 60s and the 70s, there was plenty of mass murder going on at high levels of government. I mean, just look at Lyndon Johnson, for instance, running as a candidate who wanted to take care of poor people, and then very quickly changing the direction of the country to escalate, to ramp up the Vietnam War, and causing untold deaths. Untold deaths. Even today, the Vietnamese people do not know exactly how many of their people died. We claim 58,000 U.S. soldiers died. That's probably true. The number for the Vietnamese who died in the Vietnam War is considered to be around 2 million. The 9/11 wars that are still going on, more or less, after that were launched by George W. Bush very soon after 9/11, have claimed well over 1 million lives. I just saw a new study that claims 500,000 in Iraq alone. And I think that's a very low and very conservative figure. I'd say it's well over 1 million people died in Iraq during the Second Iraq War. And why? No collusion was ever found, no responsibility in Iraq for 9/11 was ever found. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. He was a secular dictator. He persecuted religious fanatics. He felt they were a threat, and indeed they were to him, to a secular regime like Saddam Hussein. Yes, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. And I've had friends of mine say, well, weren't we justified to destroy Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator? No, we were not. There is no mandate anywhere that says millions must die because they are under the thumb of a brutal dictator. Nevertheless, when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton engineered with their other allies an attack which destroyed Libya and toppled the dictator, brutal dictator, Omar Gaddafi, many of my friends on the left shrugged their shoulders and said, well, he deserved it. He was a brutal dictator. and how many people have died and continue to die in the failed state, which is now Libya, as a direct result of the massive war crime committed by them, by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who was his Secretary of State at the time. Now we have George W. Bush. We have George W. Bush, of course, is still alive and still unindicted for anything that he did, as most presidents are. It is very rare, and I don't remember an instance in which an American president has been indicted for a crime that he committed while in office, or a crime that he committed before he came to office, as far as that goes. The typical attitude toward an American president is that they are kind of off limits, they are above the law, and that they cannot be held to account. So it is very unlikely that Barack Obama will be held to account for any of the crimes that he committed, or any of the crimes that any American president has committed against American law and international law while they were in office. And you could say, well, yeah, but Trump is different. Trump is going to be held to account for his crimes. Well, first of all, I need to know what his crimes are. What has he done that is criminal while in office? And people say, well, Trump is a fascist dictator. Well, I heard something very interesting on NPR the other day, and it was an interview with a 100-year-old survivor of the Nazi oppression, a Jewish woman, very old woman. And so the young woman who was interviewing her on the radio said, well, how is Trump like Hitler? And she goes, oh, just in every way. He is. Except the only difference is that that in America we have a free press. And when Hitler came to power, he shut down the free press right away, immediately, the first thing he did. And I thought to myself, that is a very important statement. And I could tell that the interviewer really didn't like that she said that, because it sort of went against the narrative that she was trying to sort of urge or encourage this old woman to create for her. So she said, but tell me how he's like Hitler. And she really couldn't, of course the old woman really couldn't come up with anything. So it ended up that the interview completely backfired on the interviewer, and the takeaway was, well, Donald Trump is really not like Hitler, according to this little old woman, because that's absolutely true. There's another thing that a true dictator does. A dictator always disarms the people. So you close down the free press, dissent is stifled. Journalists are jailed, dissenters, anybody who's a dissenter, whether they might be from the religious part of or the secular, or the intellectuals, or the journalists, and writers, novelists, even poets, musicians even. Anybody who speaks out against the regime is either killed or jailed, or at the very minimum threatened. Their lives are threatened. And I haven't seen Trump do any of that. He hasn't shut down the free press. He complains about the press a lot. He claims they're against him. And they're trying to say that he's a dictator and a racist and everything else under the sun, which they are trying to do. And during his historic press conference right after the midterms, it was about an hour and 20 minutes long, a woman journalist says to him, "You call yourself a nationalist. Doesn't that mean you're a white nationalist?" Or this is a paraphrase. And he says, "That is a racist question." And so he's accused of being a racist after this exchange, brief exchange, because he told her he believed that, and this woman was a black journalist, that it was a racist question. So, in other words, it's a denial that he is a white nationalist. He says he is a nationalist. He does not say he is a white nationalist. And yet, we are supposed to believe that somehow nationalism is a bad word. Well, many Americans are not going to go along with that idea. We are not going to agree with that. And just because the legacy media says that nationalism, to be a nationalist, to believe in the nation state, and to be a patriot, and consider that the nation state is very important for our well-being as citizens of that nation state, for Americans, to believe anything else, that there's something wrong with being proud of your country and wanting to protect the sovereignty of your country, there is something deeply wrong if we're not supposed to use the word nationalist. For a long time, the left, their big word was racist. You're a racist. They said Trump is a racist. And anybody who supported Trump is a racist. And at the same time, they said, well, Trump is a Nazi. He's a dictator. He's literally Hitler. And anyone who supports or voted for Trump is also a Nazi. And these people don't even know what Nazis are. They don't even have a clue what was going on in Nazi Germany and what they were all about and how brutal they were against dissenters. I mean, in Nazi Germany, the brown shirts literally went around beating up people, destroying their shops, harassing them, humiliating them. You know, you had old Jewish men, they would cut their beard off. They would do anything that they could to harass them. They would tell them to get out of the country. And yet, we are seeing those exact same actions and more being committed by Antifa today. Antifa, who are claiming they are anti-fascist. They're using fascist tactics, violence. They are rioting because conservative speakers try to come and speak at universities. They are pepper spraying supporters of Trump. They are hitting them with bike locks. These are all documented. They are punching them. They are harassing them. We have a very famous video that went viral of a guy dumping a Coke on a supporter of Trump on his head. The kid's own Coke. The guy was a teenager. Had red MAGA hat on. Guy takes the hat off, grabs the teenager's Coke and pours it over his head, then throws the ice at him. While the kid is just sitting there. And that's just one instance. There have been hundreds, something like over 500 or 600 incidents. They've been shot at. There was a senator who was severely wounded during a baseball practice of conservative lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, where a shooter just came up and started shooting them. And right now, there's a tremendous effort to overturn the results of the election. The Democrats should be happy. They got the House, but apparently they're not, and they want more. These things all change. None of this will ever stay the same. This is the way politics is. They will get their chance again. They should not despair. If you look at the history of the United States and the voters like to switch parties. They like to give one party a chance to clean up the mess or to do something good. They gave Barack Obama 8 years. He was president. The president has a lot of power, the head of the executive branch. And there's a lot that he could have done to further the cause of peace, to further the cause of environmental protections, to further the cause of, let's say, ethnic minorities who've always been struggling, to further the economic prosperity and well-being of the American citizens. He could have done so much, but he got very little done. And you could say, well, you could blame it on the Republicans. He did have some things that he could have done that he didn't do. Any president has a lot of power. He could have done more, but he didn't do it. He could have made an effort to stop the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. He didn't. And he really, I felt personally very much betrayed by Barack Obama after voting for him twice, when he never stopped either the Iraq war or the war in Afghanistan during 8 years. It still continues to this day. We just had Veterans Day, and the veterans, and I feel a lot of compassion for the wounded veterans, but I think one of the worst wounds that a veteran can feel is that he really didn't even know why he was doing it. And then he has to pay this terrible price by becoming wounded. And God forbid he should die in this situation. Fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan. Why? History has shown that you do not win. An invading force does not win in Afghanistan. They never win. And this has been going on for literally thousands of years in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not called the graveyard of empires for nothing. The Taliban is supported to a large extent by the people of Afghanistan. Not everybody likes the Taliban, but not everybody likes the government either. In fact, there are probably as many people who like the Taliban as who like the government, or there may even be more people who like the Taliban than those who like the government. And I think the typical Afghan citizen really doesn't want to be ruled by anyone, and just wants to be left alone. They don't want to be ruled by the Taliban or the government. And in fact, this is the way many people in the world would like to exist. They just want to be left alone. They live in their villages. They have their elders. They make their own laws. They enforce their own laws. Now you can say, well, this is very unfair because these laws are absolutely devastating to the rights of women. There's all kinds of awful things that go on in many, many countries to women and children both. And this is, of course, absolutely true. But that's one thing that I haven't heard as a reason for why we are in Afghanistan. I heard it back in 2001 when we attacked Afghanistan and invaded, that, the situation of the women is really bad because of the Taliban who ruled Afghanistan at that time. And they can't go outside, and they have to wear burqas, and they have to, if they're going to go outside, they have to be accompanied by a male relative, or their husband, or their son, or something like that. And yes, for the most part, that is true, except in Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan, and is more easygoing, I guess, more westernized, more metropolitan, more liberal, I guess you could say. Not so strictly religious, not so old-fashioned, because really we're looking at a kind of a medieval worldview in which women don't have the rights that men do in Afghanistan, and of course in many, many other countries, and have virtually no rights. I mean, in their religion, if you say, I divorce you 3 times, then they're divorced. But only the man has the right to say, I divorce you 3 times. And it's a divorce. If the woman does it, nothing will happen. She doesn't have that right. So it's not an equal, they're not equal under the law, under the religious law, under Sharia law. And yet, I think that many of Afghan people would say, well, Sharia law, we like Sharia law because it's very strict and people get punished for wrongdoing. And my understanding is that the alternative is basically anarchy or no law. And the government cannot be expected to enforce the laws. And also they're very religious people, and they believe that, well, this is Allah's law. And Allah is right, of course, and He's all-knowing and all, that's the one that's in the Quran, and we're going to follow that. But for Americans to go in there and say that we're going to fix this is just impossible. It's not going to work. And all it does is bring suffering to the Americans and to the Afghans. And yet we continue to remain in Afghanistan. The Afghan War is now the longest war in American history. It's called the Long War. That's what they call it in the military. Oh, they expected it to be long. They knew it would be long. I mean, you don't go into Afghanistan and then just win. You don't. So basically, the only true winners are Raytheon and all the other manufacturers of weaponry, uniforms, ammunition, ordnance, all the systems of war. So America has been placed in a permanently warlike stance. There is no peace. There will never be peace in America. There will always be wars because it's required for the profit margin to continue, for the many, many powerful military suppliers that are American. Remember, America is the arms supplier to the world. Most countries that make the weapons of war are American. And so there's a very powerful interest by many, many people in America, including politicians, whose bread and butter in their states, whose industries are relying on the manufacture of weapons. And those weapons, of course, and that ammo, they have to be used up. Those trucks, those uniforms, everything has to be used up. They have to be destroyed. They must be destroyed, so new ones can be made. So it's a continuous war footing, and the American people are paying for this. So many of our tax dollars goes to provide that strong military. Now, Trump, being a nationalist, sees that as necessary, as a good thing. It's prosperity. It's like Diamond and Silk said. Diamond said, Trump sees only one color, and that's green. So the idea that Trump is a racist is just ridiculous. And yet, so Trump has weaknesses that the Democrats could exploit. They could say, well, Trump is not ending the war in Afghanistan. He's not ending the war in Iraq. He's not ending the war in Yemen. We supply the Saudi Arabians with a lot of their weapons that they're using against this very poverty-stricken country of Yemen. Well, we supply a lot of other countries with weapons too, not just them. And we have, instead, this obsession with these false accusations against Trump, that Trump is a racist. Why go for that? It's never going to fly. Only the people who don't like Trump are going to go along with that. It's not going to convince people who like Trump, who like his policies, who are seeing the return of industry that was in China, that was in other countries, because he lowered the corporate tax rate to make it more competitive with other countries who already have low corporate tax rates. And that makes America more attractive to business. If you have a willing workforce who are willing to work for not a lot of money, and you have low corporate taxes, and you have you have a really good market, like you have a market for those goods, and America certainly has a market, and if people were working in America, they would buy the goods that are created in America. And so you get this synergy going, and that is actually what's happening. So now you have more people working that have happened since like the end of World War II. It's just an amazing economic rebirth, and it's because of the Trump policies. It is not because of the Barack Obama policies or the George W. Bush policies. But Trump made some changes right away, lowering personal income taxes. That gives people more money to spend to buy goods, to buy things, and improves their quality of life. So we have, this is why Trump is liked by so many people. Not so much because of the man, although some people think that Trump is very entertaining and really very funny. And he actually is. He's certainly one of the most entertaining presidents that we've had in my lifetime. I can't think of another president who even approaches him in just his sheer ability just to be amazing and eye-opening, these statements, and just, I mean, the press absolutely loves him. The media adores him. They're making so much money off of Trump because everything he says is just bombshell after bombshell, and he does it deliberately. He knows how to keep the pot stirring, to keep everything boiling, to keep everything hot, to keep everything amazing and exciting and people focused on him. So he can have the ear and the eyes of the nation on him, and then he can explain himself, what he's doing. And he says, well, when I said this, I really didn't mean that. Let me explain what I mean. And of course, the media doesn't like him because they want a Marxist. They're left-wingers. They believe that capitalism is bad and that we need Marxism, we need socialism. And you could say, well, Sweden is a socialist country. Look at how well they're doing. Well, Sweden is not a socialist country. Sweden is a capitalist country. It has some socialist policies. We also have some socialist policies. There is something to be said for socialism. But to actually have a socialist country would be Cuba, would be North Korea, would be the former Soviet Union, would be the People's Republic of China, the Communist Chinese, would be the failed state that is Venezuela, which had a socialist system which failed. The problem with socialism is that it is too dangerous, and it's too much power in the hands of too few people who are easily corruptible. We cannot turn our personal sovereignty over to the government. What I hear on NPR over and over and over is government solutions to the problems that are problems that should be resolved within the family, within the individual, within the community, in a very small, incremental way. The most that government should be allowed to do is they can influence, they can put out information that could be helpful. But do they do that? No. Do they try to encourage Americans to rely on their family, to get along as a family? The family structure has been proven to be helpful in so many ways throughout history that is why it's been adapted by the human, by Homo sapiens. I mean, even animals use the family structure. Many animals. It's not just a human thing, but it's very important. I was seeing a documentary about crows, and crows are very family-oriented. The children stay with the family and for quite a long time, and they continue to learn from the adults. And they don't go off to a government training camp and have the government teach the children, the little crows. No, they don't. They stay in the family. There's no reason in the world why parents should not be encouraged to pass on their values to their children. I mean, this is a source of diversity. If you do not want diversity, you would want to get them out of the hands of their parents, who might be socialists or might be conservatives or might be religious, very religious, or might be atheists, or might have any kind of different view on things that you could possibly imagine. You know, that's the one thing you don't want. You don't want to drag them away and put them into a situation where all the children are learning exactly the same thing. And they're all competing with each other to see who can get the top score. And then those with the top score, they're passed on. They're passed up, and they rise up into society. And the others are shunted off in a different direction. In other words, you're just using human beings as a resource that you can exploit, rather than allowing human beings to do their thing individually. But that's not the goal of human life. The goal of human life is not to create a collective society in which everyone thinks alike. The goal of God, by creating humans, was to create individuals. That's what we are. We're individuals. And the government really hates this, the idea of individuals, because it means individual really doesn't need government that much. Because an individual stands on his or her own 2 feet and is not beholden and doesn't rely on the government. They rely on themselves. It's called self-reliance. And Marxists and socialists really despise the idea of individualism, because it means that they don't need socialism. You know, it's not necessary in their lives. On NPR and other legacy Marxist socialist networks, they're constantly harping on government solutions. How can governments fix this problem? How can government make people more happy? Well, it very clearly states in the founding documents of the United States of America that that is not the role of government. Government has a role, but it's not. But creating happiness for its citizens is not one of those goals. Happiness is something that is found within each individual. There is no communal happiness. And this is one of the problems with Chinese communism. Chinese Communist Society is the largest communist society in the world, by far. It is very controlled. And people in China fear to criticize the government because they know there will be repercussions. Those who do not conform in Chinese society are frowned upon at the very least. And there's a Muslim Christian or a Muslim sect that's in the far west part of China. I think they're called Uyghurs, something like that. They're being re-educated right now. There are supposed to be camps where thousands or if not millions of these people are being re-educated into the atheistic views of the Chinese Communist state. And these are pretty religious people. And they're being tortured and they're suffering. And this is all for the good of the society, supposedly. But in reality, it's for the good of the rulers of Communist China. They are the ones who benefit. because they need a population that is docile and fearful and utterly debased and willing, because they have no other choice, to do anything that is required of them. They want willing subjects rather than independently thinking sovereign and individual citizens. Because they know they would be overthrown. If the Chinese people were able to understand that their lives could be much better and they would be happier without the boot heel of the communist state on their necks for 50, 80, 100 years. Not quite 100 years yet. I think communism in China came in 1950. So we're 68 years, I guess, into the communist Chinese rule over the Chinese people. And some people in China are getting very rich. And why are they getting rich? They're getting rich because of capitalism. Because the Chinese communists realized that only by allowing capitalism in would the Chinese communist system survive. Do you get the irony of that? The communists reject the idea of capitalism. And yet, they prosper when capitalism is brought in. You know, and individuals are allowed to start companies, and they capitalize those companies. And even American companies are in communist China. But many of them are not. Many of the American companies, I think, would rather be in the United States, and some of them are returning to the United States because of the strictures of this heavy weight of the communists trying to run the show and limit what they can do and prevent them from being innovative. That's one of the things that communism and socialism does. It prevents you from being innovative, because when a person innovates, that is an act of an individual. An individual comes up with an idea that makes something better, or invents something, or improves something, or reforms something. It's not a group, or it's not a decision by the state. The state didn't make it, or the people as a group didn't make it. An individual came up with that idea. And that and so individual thinking is discouraged in China. That's why they need to steal so many of their ideas. They just steal them. They don't come up, the Chinese don't come up with their own ideas, so they steal them. The government does, or individuals working for the government do. And that's why there's so many problems. This is one of the difficulties that America has been having with China. And that's one of the reasons Trump is in a trade war with China. He wants them to stop ignoring copyright. You know, the copyright infringement, they just ignore that. Intellectual property rights. They do whatever they want. They can get away with it. Because it's government that's doing it. The government's not going to chastise itself. This is what is inherently wrong. And the feminists in the United States, they like to, essentially the feminism in the United States, it's really Marxism, but they use feminism as a cover, and they pretend that the male capitalists are the bad guys, and the women who love, you know, who are socialists and who want a socialist system, and get rid of the men in charge who are capitalists. And it's they're constantly putting paternalism, capitalism together. Paternalistic capitalism. Paternalistic capitalism. How many times have I heard that? It's men. Men are capitalists, women, and they're bad. Women are socialists, and they're good. This is false. This is a fraud. This is deception. This is not the way it is in reality. This is not the way it ever, ever, ever has been. Socialism has not been particularly good for women. In the long run, socialism has been in communist China for, like I said, 68 years, I guess, about. And has it really made life great for women in China? I don't think so. I don't think so. At first, the dictator in the socialist country can do a lot of good because he's a dictator. Not because it's socialism, but because they have the power. Socialism gives the leader incredible power. So they can say, well, we can fix this problem, and it's easy. They can fix it because all you have to do is just decree it. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to fix that. When Hitler came into power, he had so much power, he was able to bring Germany out of the poverty of the Depression. He got people working because he just decreed it. We're going to build an Autobahn system. We're going to build the people's car. He called it the Volkswagen. So people can drive. It's going to be cheap. It's going to be simple. And he did this, and he did that, and he did this, and he did all this stuff. And he made the people just love him. Does this sound like Trump? This doesn't sound anything like Trump. Hitler was adored by the German people at first. Many, 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 many German people. There were only a few who could really see through it. They could see where this was heading. But this is the difficulty. Whenever you give one man that much power, it is almost certain, it is virtually certain that that power will be used to oppress those who disagree with his agenda. And there will be people who disagree with his agenda. This is inevitable because no one ever always agrees on everything, no matter how good it is. And is Trump arresting journalists? Not as far as I know. I don't think he is. He complains about them, but he doesn't stop them. He doesn't arrest them. He doesn't suppress them. He doesn't have them murdered. He doesn't shut down CNN. He doesn't shut down MSNBC. He doesn't shut down NBC. He doesn't shut down the Huffington Post. He doesn't shut down the Washington Post. He doesn't shut down the New York Times. He hasn't done any of that. He hasn't even shut down the Mueller investigation. So how is Trump a dictator? He's not doing anything to make him act like a dictator. So people have to, this is just a waste of breath. People aren't buying it. American people aren't buying it. That's why there was no blue wave in the midterm. That's why the Democrats are having to resort to actual theft in order to get some more power. They want more power. They got more power. They wanted more power. They got more power. But that's not enough for them. So now they're attempting to steal by various shenanigans, which is a long tradition in American politics. And now the lawyers are lining up. The armies of lawyers, they're going to fight it out. It's going to take weeks or months. before shakes out. And they're going to, as soon as Nancy Pelosi, if she gets to be the speaker, they're going to start investigating something Trump did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, something his son did, something Melania did, who knows what they did. And all these things are they want to stop Trump from doing what he's going to do. Maybe they will stop it. And then and what will Trump do? I don't know. Will Trump even survive without being assassinated until 2020? Who knows? The mainstream media is encouraging violence. Resist. Go to their homes, harass them, shout at them, threaten the conservatives. Where will it all end? It will not end. So that's all there is for today. Have a great weekend and sleep well.